All right, Dave, take it away.
Okay, so this is definitely an older tool, but I thought it was pretty cool. So I wanted to talk about it. So there's this tool called the Browser Exploitation Framework, which allows you to do client-side attacks on web browsers. And I thought that was pretty neat. And so I've used it before in my Kali environment, but, and I've done some things where like port forwarding and dynamic DNS. But I wanted to see what could I spin this up on a virtual private server and get access to it on a domain. And I haven't done a whole lot else with it. So, here we go. Okay, so I have a droplet here in DigitalOcean. I'm not going to show the public IP quite yet of that. So let's just kind of go through it, right? So I currently have the BeEF. Well, there we go. There's my public IP sitting on this IP. So it's actually being served out. But what I've done is I've downloaded this game and I've added the hook.js to it. So what BeEF has is it has a hook.js. It's a JavaScript. Browsers tend to trust JavaScript by default. And once it's hooked, it grabs that BeEF hook and it phones home back to the BeEF server. Right, so here we go. I've hooked myself, and all I've really done, right, is here at maskline.fun, right, and we can kind of view some of the source real quick. So scroll down, right? So this game, I pulled it off of GitHub. It was using a bunch of script sources, right? So a lot of people will load in JavaScript from other locations. And I've just set the script source to be the BeEF server, right? So when you visit the site, you're now hooked by the BeEF server. And once that's there, you can start sending commands into the victim that you've hooked, right? So we can change this and say, hello, friends, and we can execute it. And this is just going to display a notification bar, and it says, hello, friends, right? So this is just me sitting out on the internet, connecting back to my BeEF server. There's some other things that BeEF would allow you to do. You can hook in Metasploit modules, so you could actually drop Metasploit modules to it. In a previous video, we talked about Go Fish, so that might be an interesting idea to serve up a phishing campaign that has JavaScript hooks in it that call back to a BeEF server, right? And you could start obfuscating some of these things, right? If I went further, I could set up my domain names to actually be the maskline.fun. And so when people are looking at the script, they're not just seeing random IP addresses that are pointing to the hook.js. There's APIs that you can extend within BeEF. And there's quite a few other things that we can do, right? This may be a little loud, but we should be able to execute a sound. So I just sent a blast. And all this is because now that I have command of the browser, I can start sending interesting things to it, right? So I can, if I was so inclined, I could modify this, and maybe I should, to start putting in different redirects to different pages, right? So this will redirect you to Gmail. And if you took the time, you might be able to set up this page to look more like Gmail. So I'll just put in username. Well, okay, I guess that's interesting. I can't quite seem to type all the way. So there's just some interesting things with it where it's like, you should be hooked into BeEF, right? So this is kind of the idea here, is that BeEF is really just a system for you to like teach people about the dangers of cross-site scripting. I don't know if it's really something that you would want to like fully extend into a pen test domain. It would take a lot of time, I think, to modify it and kind of get rid of some of those things where it's like, hey, the redirect sends you back. But looking at the page itself, right? So after it's done, it redirects you to this XSS hook URL. And so what we're actually doing here, and one of the things, if you start playing with BeEF, you can use Metasploitable and the damn vulnerable web app, and you can start injecting your hook.js strings into the damn vulnerable web app, and it will actually start hooking the browser itself. So this is cross-site scripting, but this is not permanent cross-site scripting, right? This is ephemeral. So if I was to navigate away from this BeEF page, I'm going to eventually lose the browser that I dropped in there, right? And just to show that I'm not doing anything that would necessarily mean that like I used this just this computer and I set anything up, I'll go here to my Windows computer. And if it ever comes on, maybe it won't, maybe it will, because I really don't have a whole lot of RAM. Okay, I guess it won't. But that's kind of the idea, right? Oh, there we go. So I guess it's up. So if I visit maskline.fun, this is just a brand new Firefox browser that I downloaded into my development Windows environment. Anybody can grab these. They're hosted by Microsoft. You can just go and download the VM. And it's taking a second to load. And here comes the game. So if I really wanted to extend this, I probably would want to get rid of, not having HTTPS locks on there to make me think that, this is a better site than it really is. And let's just wait. Let's see if our browser got hooked. And it looks like it hasn't been hooked yet. So that's kind of the general idea of BeEF. You can spend, oh, there it is. So now we've got the Windows browser. And another thing that you can do with BeEF is you can actually start getting information about your zombies. That's what they're called. Whenever you hook them in. There's some other functionality that you can extend with it. Once you've hooked a zombie, you can then proxy the traffic through the zombie to go and start browsing the web or send commands to other places. So that's kind of neat. Definitely things that might be fun to play around with. And sometimes it's a little difficult to navigate around, but it starts picking up the different user agent strings and the HTTP messages that are being sent back and forth between the site. That's all being picked up through the hook.js. So we can get like the location. I've changed my VPN. So now it knows the location of where I am. It's saying the time zone because I've set it to be closer to Arizona. So that's definitely interesting. And there's a lot of different commands that we can send. And sometimes we get better commands than others once we're in, right? So there's definitely a lot of different things that you could extend here, right? We could start dropping binary shells, Metasploit shells in place through BeEF, and we could do a whole lot more with it. If you were so inclined, you could start opening webcams to try to get access to what the person is looking at. We can send requests and check whether or not they've looked at a specific URL. Maybe we're doing targeted phishing and we want to see this browser hasn't looked at that particular URL. So it's going to return as false. Let's see here. Brings up a clippy image and asks them to do stuff. So this will just send out a dropper.exe. So the same kind of idea, Kunz, that you were talking about with your pivot. That might be a nice way to serve a pivot to someone. So I'm just going to execute that and see if it dropped in. and Clippy came up and it says your browser's out of date, would you like to upgrade it? I'm gonna go ahead and say yes, because I'm going to trust the Clippy. And so a download should probably start. And that's kind of the idea, right? So this is a front door attack. A lot of times, from what I've been reading and understanding, is that it takes a while for you to actually start getting a footprint into an environment. And I thought that BeEF was an interesting way to start doing that. So that's about all that I have. One last thing that I want to show is, because I'm going to tear this site down, so there's not really an issue doing it, is I wanted to show what the config file looked like for that, because that's the part that took me a lot of time to figure out. So let's cd into BeEF and BeEF, and we'll clear, and then we'll run an ls. So this config.yaml, config.yml, I'm going to open in Vim, is where you would start setting up a lot more of the functionality. So the part that I needed to set up was I set up the credentials. You have to change that. That's also used by the API. So there's an API in BeEF and you can extend it. I needed to set up the HTTPS server here. This will be commented out to set it to be public. When you install it by default in Kali, it's not serving the IP address out. So you will have to change that. And then here's where you can start pointing it to other things like different origins for cross-site origins, the web sockets, there's where the database is, there's a geolocation IP. So that's how it's picking up where that IP is coming in. You have to update that. But there's more that you can extend in here, right? We could set Metasploit to be enabled to true, and we could follow some of their documentation, and then we would understand some more about it. And I'm going to go ahead and exit out of Vim. So to do that, I'm going to do Shift:*Q exclamation point so that I quit and I'm not writing anything, and I'm going to quit with force. And now I'm back to BeEF. And another thing that you can do is if you're actively watching your session, you can see here in the log what's happening as BeEF is going through. One of the limitations to BeEF is that it only, right now, as far as I understand, I would have to extend it a little more to make it a multi-tenant environment, because as it sits right now, I'm the only user using BeEF. So with that, that's all I really wanted to show. There's definitely a lot of functionality to this. We could, do all kinds of things. We could even ask for it to execute a screenshot. And if it worked, it may or may not. There's a lot of things that are may or may not with BeEF, because it's kind of an older tool, and development has been pretty slow with it. But I thought it was pretty cool, and I thought it was a pretty neat idea to start getting your head around the idea of what does cross-site scripting look like. I think a future idea might be fun to actually have Wireshark going and Burp Suite going at the same time, so that you can intercept the traffic as you're being connected to BeEF. So you can kind of understand what's happening with these different HTTP messages as the cross-site scripting takes place. So with that, I'm done. I'm gonna stop my sharing. And does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, Dave, quickly. So, you did that dropper with a Clippy. So if you were to run that dropper, would that dropper make another connection back to your BeEF console? Is that what that dropper is? What is that dropper?
Yeah, so Clippy. So let me bring up Clippy again. So all this really does is that you can mount a .exe in BeEF as per this file. You read the README and it tells you what to do. And you put the binary there. And because I didn't load a binary, nothing showed up. And you can also modify what Clippy does. So you could change Clippy to not be the old Microsoft paperclip, although I think that's just the coolest thing in the world. I'm so sad that they got rid of it because it was my childhood. But you could extend that around, right? So like you could change the image to that be, say, like an organization that we were targeting, right? Like if we were, I don't know, doing a pen test against the the kitten clothing company, and we wanted to put the logo of the kitten clothing company there, we could put it there, and then you could change what executable it's pointing to, and then you could drop it onto the system.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and there's a whole lot else that you can do with it, right? Like if they've got Firefox, you could start dropping like reverse shells. You could start doing bind shells. You can also have persistence, which it doesn't exactly work out of the box. You have to work on it. But this will drop like man in the URL, man in the browser. And if it executes successfully, this means that the XML HTTP request open override. So when you try to exit away from it, you're not going to lose access to that browser session, although I haven't had great success. And there's a little more that you would actually need to do to get this to work on phones. Android phones actually tend to be pretty easy to grab with BeEF, anything even including Brave, but like iOS is a lot harder to do. Thank you, Candy.
Yeah. All righty.